A 12-year-old girl was selling cookies for her chemo until Clint Eastwood walked up and did something no one expected. The open-air market in San Diego hums with energy. The scent of grilled corn, cinnamon-roasted nuts, and fresh sourdough bread floats through the air, mingling with the salty breeze from the nearby coast. Stalls line both sides of the walkway, each bursting with color. Hand-woven baskets, jars of golden honey, trays of freshly picked fruit. Vendors call out to potential customers, their voices rising above the distant sound of a street musician strumming his guitar. In the middle of it all, a small folding table stands alone. No flashy banners, no bright decorations, just a plain white sign with neat, careful handwriting. Homemade cookies, raising money for my chemo. Behind the table sits 12-year-old Madison. Her frame is small, her posture straight, but the shadows beneath her eyes tell a different story. The heat presses down on her, beads of sweat forming at her temple. But she doesn't complain. She can't. Not when there's so much at stake. Her cookies are wrapped in clear plastic, tied with thin ribbons, each one a labor of love. She spent the evening before baking them with her mother, rolling the dough with trembling hands, pushing through the fatigue that never fully fades. She had to take breaks, resting her head on the cool kitchen counter while the oven timer ticked down. But she wouldn't let herself stop. Now, she sits patiently, watching as people pass by. Some slow down, reading her sign before offering a polite smile and moving on. Others don't even glance her way. Madison doesn't blame them. The market is full of distractions. Dozens of vendors competing for attention. A woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat stops, reaching into her purse. "I'll take a bag, sweetheart." Madison forces a smile, her fingers moving clumsily as she hands over a package. The woman slips a $5 bill into the cash box. "Hope you get better soon, honey." Madison nods. She doesn't tell the woman that hope won't cover the cost of her next treatment. She watches her leave, the excitement she felt this morning slowly fading. When she set up her table, she believed she could make a real difference, help take some of the weight off her mother's shoulders. But now, as the afternoon sun stretches long shadows across the pavement, she's barely made enough to buy a single dose of the medication she needs. She takes a deep breath, blinking against the exhaustion pulling at her. She knew today wouldn't be easy, but she didn't think it would feel like this. And as she watches another customer walk past without stopping, she begins to wonder if she'll even sell enough to make this worth it. Madison shifts in her chair, rolling her shoulders to shake off the stiffness creeping in. The heat presses against her skin, heavy and unforgiving. She glances at the cash box, still barely full, not even $20. Her mother had tried to talk her out of this. "You don't have to do this, Maddie. I'll figure it out." But Madison had seen the bills stacking up on the kitchen counter, the way her mother's fingers trembled when she opened them. The way she sighed when she thought Madison was asleep, rubbing her temples in the glow of a laptop screen, searching for answers that didn't exist. She couldn't just sit back and watch. Baking cookies had always been their thing. Before the hospital visits, before the needles and the pills, they spent weekends in the kitchen together, laughing, covered in flour, sneaking chocolate chips when they thought the other wasn't looking. It was the last piece of normalcy Madison had left. So she insisted. Now, watching people pass her by, she starts to wonder if she made a mistake. The little boy tugs at his father's hand, pointing to the cookies, but the man shakes his head, distracted by his phone. A teenage girl lingers for a moment before moving on, her hands full of bags from other stalls. Madison doesn't blame them. They don't know her. They don't owe her anything. But as another hour slips by and the crowd begins to thin, frustration builds in her chest. She clenches her fists under the table, her body aching, the familiar fatigue settling into her bones. She spent so much time fighting, against her body, against the sickness, against the odds, and now she's fighting for something else, to matter. A woman stops, her eyes flicking between Madison and the sign. She hesitates, then leans in and whispers, "Where are your parents?" Madison freezes. "I'm here by myself." The woman frowns, shifting uncomfortably. Well, maybe someone should be helping you. You shouldn't have to be out here. And then she walks away. Madison stares at the ground, her jaw tightening. She knows she shouldn't have to be here. She knows. But what choice does she have? But just as she's about to pack up and call it a day, she hears it. The hushed murmurs, the shift in the energy around her. The market had started to slow down. Vendors were packing up their unsold goods, tired parents were coaxing their kids toward the parking lot, and the golden afternoon light was beginning to stretch long shadows across the pavement. Madison counted the bills in her cash box again, willing the number to change. It didn't. $18. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in her throat. She wasn't expecting to raise thousands today, but she had hoped to at least make a difference, enough to take even a little pressure off her mother's shoulders. Instead, she felt like she was drowning. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table as another wave of exhaustion hit. Her body always did this, betrayed her when she needed it most. Madison squeezed her eyes shut for a second, pulling in a breath. Just a little longer. Just a few more sales. But as she opened her eyes, she realized something had changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, a quiet ripple through the market. A group of people had stopped walking, their heads turning in unison toward something behind her. A few murmurs rose, low but charged with something unusual. Madison frowned. She turned her head slightly, following their line of sight. And that's when she saw him. At first, he just looked like another shopper, a tall man in a dark button-down and jeans moving through the market at an unhurried pace. But there was something about him, a weight in his presence, a kind of stillness that made people stop mid-step. Madison blinked, her brain taking a second longer to catch up. Wait! Even though he was older, his face lined with decades of life, he was unmistakable. The deep-set eyes, the sharp gaze, the strong jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. Clint Eastwood. The crowd around her reacted in a way she had never seen before. Some people whispered his name under their breath, as if saying it too loud would shatter the moment. Others stood completely still, as if caught between the desire to approach him and the fear of interrupting whatever unseen force had just settled over the market. Madison had never seen anything like it. Her mother had always talked about him, about the movies, about the grit and presence he carried even when he didn't say a word. But now, standing right in front of her, he felt larger than life. And then, he stopped, right in front of her table. For a long second, Madison couldn't breathe. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze shifting over her table. The cookies, the cash box, the sign. His eyes lingered on the words. Homemade cookies. Raising money for my chemo. Madison didn't move. She wasn't even sure if she could. The world had shrunk to just this moment. Just her, the table, and Clint Eastwood reading the words that had felt so personal just minutes ago. And then he reached into his pocket. The crowd leaned in, waiting. Madison's heart pounded. Her breath caught somewhere between hope and disbelief. Was he about to buy a cookie? Say something? Offer a kind word? Whatever it was, she knew one thing. This moment was about to change everything. Madison watched in silence as Clint Eastwood pulled out his wallet. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, a strange mix of excitement, disbelief, and something deeper, something unspoken. He didn't reach for a $5 bill or a 10. Instead, he pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills. The air around them shifted. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, people leaning in, straining to see if what they were witnessing was actually real. Madison's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for a bag of cookies. "Sir," her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "It's $5 a bag." Clint glanced up, those piercing eyes locking onto hers. "I know," he said, voice low, gravelly. The kind of voice that carried history in it. He placed the entire stack of bills into her cash box. The world seemed to stop. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "That's got to be at least $5,000. Madison just stared. Her breath hitched. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. I can't take this," she stammered. It's too much. But Clint Eastwood didn't take the money back. Instead, he reached for a bag of cookies, took one out, and broke off a piece. "You made these yourself?" he asked, his tone steady, unshaken by the growing attention around them. Madison swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." He popped the piece into his mouth, chewing slowly. Then he nodded slightly. "Good cookie." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Then, in a voice just loud enough for her to hear, he said, "Kid, you're tougher than most people I've met." Madison's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. The exhaustion she had been fighting all day, the worry, the frustration, the quiet fear that this was all for nothing, it all came crashing down at once. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. But the moment wasn't over yet, because what happened next would turn this from a generous act into something even bigger. The crowd erupted. People who had been frozen just moments ago suddenly sprang into action. Some gasped, others clapped. A few even whistled, their excitement bubbling over. Someone in the back shouted, "Did that really just happen?" Madison, still stunned, could barely hear them. Her eyes were locked on the stack of bills sitting in her cash box. More money than she had ever seen in her life. She looked back up at Clint Eastwood, her hands shaking slightly. I don't even know what to say," she whispered. He held her gaze for a moment, then said simply, "Just keep fighting." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Madison sat there, motionless, as the whispers and murmurs around her grew louder. And then something unexpected happened. A man stepped forward, pulling out his wallet. He grabbed a bag of cookies and placed a $100 bill into the cash box. "I'll take one," he said, "and keep the change." Then another person, and another. It was like a floodgate had opened. One by one, strangers came forward, each dropping money into the box. 20s, 50s, even more hundreds. The woman who had walked away earlier, the one who had said, "You shouldn't have to be out here," came back. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pressed a crisp $50 bill into Madison's hands and squeezed her fingers gently. "You're not alone, sweetheart," she said softly. Tears burned at the edges of Madison's vision. She looked at the cash box, now overflowing, then at the line forming in front of her table. People weren't just buying cookies anymore. They were rallying behind her. A single moment had turned into something much bigger. Madison wiped at her eyes, trying to keep herself together. She had spent so much time feeling like she was fighting alone, like she was carrying a weight too heavy for someone her age. But now, looking at the faces in front of her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But there was still one thing left to do. Madison took a shaky breath, staring at the overflowing cash box. This wasn't just money. It was proof that people cared, that strangers who had no reason to had chosen to stand with her. For so long, she had watched her mother struggle, had listened to doctors talk in numbers and probabilities, had felt the weight of an illness that made her feel like a burden. But today, everything felt different. The last person in line, an older man with a kind face, handed her another $100 bill. He didn't even take a bag of cookies. "I lost my wife to cancer," he said gently. "I wish I could have done more for her. But today, I can do something for you." Madison pressed the bill between her fingers, her throat tightening. She didn't know how to say thank you in a way that could possibly match what she was feeling. So instead, she met his eyes and said, "I won't stop fighting." A small smile crossed his face. "That's all any of us can do." As the market began to empty, Madison sat there, hands resting on the table, trying to absorb what had just happened. And then, for the first time in months, she let herself laugh. A real, honest laugh. The kind she hadn't heard from herself since before the hospital rooms. The IV drips. The late-night cries her mother thought she didn't hear. She had come here hoping to make a small difference. She never imagined she'd leave knowing she had been given something even greater. In a world that often feels cold, indifferent, and unfair, moments like these remind us of something important. Kindness is still alive. A single person, one moment of generosity, can start a ripple effect that changes lives. Clint Eastwood didn't have to stop. He didn't have to give. But he did. And because of that, so did everyone else. So the next time you see someone fighting their battle alone, ask yourself, what can I do? How can I help? Because sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to turn someone's world around. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Be someone's Clint Eastwood. If you liked this video, subscribe for more incredible stories. And if you believe in the power of kindness, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because at the end of the day, the good we put into the world always comes back.